welcome to this episode of Trader Talk TV. I'm Lindsay Rowntree, and I am joined today by the enigmatic Paula Bacariza from the Trade Desk. Paula, welcome.
Thank you.
Today we're talking about, don't roll your eyes guys, identity graphs, and graphs of graphs. But before we kick off with that, Paula, tell me about yourself and your role.
I'm Paula Bacariza, and I look after the data and strategy team in EMEA for the Trade Desk.
Amazing. So, identity. I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions around it. People are unsure of it. Let's have a refresher of what an identity graph is and an understanding of what some of those misconceptions that you come up against are.
Yeah, I guess the origin of all of this is kind of one step back and is for everybody's favorite word of omnichannel campaigns. And the difference between multi-channel and omnichannel, I think, is the first misconception that we could address.
Oh, 100%, definitely. Yeah,
okay.
It's a big one.
Well, let's go straight in.
Yeah.
Fabulous. So let's say that an advertiser has a campaign with multiple channels, so TV, mobile phone. It's been a while since they look like this, but audio and desktop. Each of these channels can be used in the same campaign, but they all have different identifiers, right? You have CTV IDs, you have maids, mostly on audio too, and in desktop you may have cookies or others. So if an advertiser is running a campaign through all of this like this, it's a multi-channel campaign because it has no way to follow the user through the funnel or the consumer journey across the channels.
Right.
The only way to have a true omni-channel campaign is if all of those go into an identity graph where there's a common identifier, let's say EUID, but it could be others. And through a common identifier, you can follow the user journey across. Now it's an omni-channel campaign.
Yeah.
So I would say key use, true omni-channel.
And so omnichannel feels like it's a big word of 2026. A lot of people are talking about it and the death of multi-channel versus trying to achieve true omnichannel. So, but it feels like the identity conversation isn't always tied in with omnichannel. Why is that? What's the barrier to connecting the dots on that one?
I question myself that often.
Interesting, yeah.
Because it is, I think one of the reasons is because maybe we don't talk enough about graphs as the simple solution that it is, and it sounds a lot more scary and complex than it actually is. It is to have the ability to connect them all. And then there is also the barrier of sometimes advertisers trying to decide what identifier they're going for or what graph are they going to use. Not all graphs are the same.
No.
So maybe we can talk about some differences and how a graph works.
Yeah,
that would be helpful.
That would be very helpful, definitely.
Okay, so a graph has a key identifier that would loop all of the device ID, and everything goes back to the device IDs, right? But a graph operates with three key constructs, which are the devices, which is true deterministic and is linked to the device's IDs. Personas, which is a group of devices that belong to a user, and households. Now, personas and household are probabilistic constructs. They are based on assumptions and deterministic links. So if you have a user that has multiple devices that are connected to a business IP 9 to 5, and then those devices are connected to a home IP in the evening, night, and morning, it's relatively easy to assume that that's their house. And as it happens, there's a CTV ID connected to that IP too.
Yep.
So that now is a household with multiple personas. And graphs are constantly redefining and improving the way they define these three constructs.
Right.
And this allows us to be super effective when we spend money on all of these channels, because then you can frequency cap, you can reduce wastage, you can improve all of your strategies. So this is super important. In my opinion, big difference between some graphs and others is the work that is behind the scenes to keep on improving and growing the graph. One example would be around a year ago, we went through a lot of work to make our construct definitions way more specific to geo. For example, today, we don't define these constructs the same way in India than we do in the UK, than we do in the US, because behavior is different.
Yeah,
in different
of course.
regions. So it gets, for a geek like us, it gets very interesting. But it is very important because there is, all of that conflict between what is deterministic versus probabilistic.
Yeah.
Actually, even if you don't love statistics as somebody like me, something that it is very, very probable is nearly deterministic. So it's more important to look at how strict and thorough a graph is when building these constructs than avoiding the beauty of using them, I would say.
Because it feels like the word probable has got a naming issue, because people think of the word probably and think, well, if it's probable, it's not definite, so I don't want anything to do with it. But that's very unfair, isn't it, in the constructs of identity to have to compare deterministic and probabilistic, and everybody says they want deterministic and want to ignore probabilistic. That causes issues if you're trying to create a true omnichannel strategy.
Correct. I think there's pros and cons to both, and the idea is pick the right probabilistic strategies and the right deterministic strategies. Deterministic, yes, technically infallible, but it doesn't allow you to frequency cap. So it has the con of money wasted on impressions that you didn't need. Probabilistic, yes, is not 100% accurate at all times, but it has the ability of reducing that wastage and giving you a way better view and scalability, which is so important. Deterministic doesn't always have the scalability that big brands need.
No, that's so interesting. So talk to me about then the graph of graphs and how that comes together and what the advantages are of a graph of graphs versus a monolithic ID single graph solution owned by one company.
Two big questions.
They are massive. Yeah. I should probably not have just loaded you with both at the same time, but here we are.
We're going to go with the first one, graph of graphs. So we said it before, right? Like there's one common identifier on one graph. However, we all know there's more than one identifier in the industry. So there's more than one graph. So graph of graph allows us to connect multiple graphs that have different identifiers. So let's say that we have that's a rubbish 5. ID5 or ramp ID. Or who else? E-metric. So now, through identity resolution, we are connecting multiple graphs and their identifiers. So we can see that the devices and the personas and the households can be linked to multiple identifiers. And these would make a graph of graphs.
Right.
So if an advertiser comes here and uses, let's say, ramp ID, and they have a campaign where they want to target the light consumers and they want to make them heavier consumers. Advertiser that uses ramp ID may send into the graph ramp ID 1, 2, 3. Now, the graph, the first thing that it would look is, do I recognize this ID, and what else do I have it linked to? What device's ID, what other identifiers, etc. So when it's looking at the bit stream, you may see an impression that has ID 5, 2, 3, 4. Now, this impression doesn't have ramp ID 1, 2, 3. So if this advertiser was only using one graph, would have never been here. But the graph of graphs knows that ID 5, 2, 3, 4 is the same persona than ramp ID 1, 2, 3. So now we don't need to say no to this impression because we know we want it. So that's the benefit of a graph of graphs, that you are using the power of all of these other identifier-based graphs to find your users, whatever identifier they have linked to them. And
so how does that get reported back to the advertiser? What does it look like for them?
I love this question. The only people that's my job loves this question, I guess.
I can imagine,
But in some cases, some graph of graphs would report back the ID that it was served on. And this can be a challenge, because this advertiser only recognizes the light users on ramp ID. So it could be looking at, okay, so ID 5235 were converted, but I know nothing about this user. However, what we do is we use something called original ID, which we pass with reds, which is like log-level data.
Right, okay.
What we do with original ID is, yes, you use identity resolution to recognize ID 5, 2, 3, 4, and serve. But then when we report back to the advertiser, we report on the original ID. So we do identity resolution back again, and we translate it back to the ID that the advertiser can recognize. Because if we don't, you may have a situation where the advertiser recognizes that there's been performance, but it doesn't know if it was the type of performance that we're looking for.
I see.
So this type of technology is important too, and looking at graphs that can do that is important too.
And so why would an advertiser, how important is it for an advertiser to understand how this works? You know, if they're putting something in and getting something back again that makes sense to them, is it important for them still to understand the inner workings of it, to the general contract of identity? Does it help them be able to do their jobs better, kind of run campaigns better? Because it feels like advertisers do want a lot more information, but then when it's given to them, they kind of go, oh, that's a lot. I'm not sure if I can cope with that. But it feels important that they should understand how this works.
I think it's important to understand how it works at a business level.
Yes.
Like, what is the problem that it's solving? This is a very clear problem, right? I need multiple graphs to help me to find my users because I can't always see an ID. Do we need to know all the little tech that works here? Personally, I would say if you work with a tech company that you trust, you cannot trust them to do all of the geeky stuff behind the scenes and give you the solutions. And if you have questions, of course, ask. Everybody loves talking about their own expertise. But I would say understanding the dynamics is important. And that is kind of that second question that you were asking of like one monolithic graph versus a graph of graphs. I think one thing that is clear to me is that there is no one identifier that solves for all problems.
No.
Identifiers have great strengths and other areas where they are not as strong. If you have a graph of graphs, you're getting the best of every identifier, and you're solving the, let's say, weakness or shortcomings with the strengths of others. And, you know, we've seen in this industry through the years many times that it doesn't matter how big or powerful one tech partner can be, it's just never going to solve for all of the problems. It's going to solve for the problems that they understand very well.
So true.
So obviously slightly biased because, you know, interoperability and openness is my thing. But I would say if you can get the best out of many identifiers, why would you restrict yourself to one and not be able to, in some cases, for example, solve this issue?
Yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, I suppose it begs the question as to why an advertiser would restrict themselves to one. And again, I assume it comes down to understanding and education.
I think so. I think sometimes it comes to understanding. Sometimes they just want to, you know, send the same ID and receive the same ID, and they're happy to go through some of the inefficiencies. But I think the more we have solutions like this, and the more we open and explain clearly and simply why interoperability and connecting multiple graphs is a really good thing. Yeah. I think the more this information comes out, the more informed advertisers would be about it.
Definitely, and it's not as complex as they might believe. Kind of the understanding the bare bones of it actually makes a lot of sense and will help empower them do their jobs better. Yeah,
absolutely.
And if you want to achieve true omnichannel campaign, true omnichannel strategy, this is a really important way to be able to input that.
For true omnichannel, you have to have an identity strategy.
Yeah.
Because if not, you're just treating each channel as a separate channel, and then all of the beauty of efficiency and optimization and understanding the flow of the consumer journey just disappears.
It's fascinating. I think that hopefully this has enlightened a lot of people, and they understand identity better and won't roll their eyes at it in future and not have fewer misconceptions. Thank you so much for coming in today, Paula.
My pleasure.
Really interesting. And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.